floor is open. Yeah.
In the Shemona Esrei we say bracha ta Hashem. So in Baruch we bend, maybe like bend a little bit. Atah we bow, and Hashem we go up.
Right.
I would think for Hashem we should bow. Why is it at Hashem's name that we go up? I mean, it seems kind of weird to me.
That's an interesting question. There's a pasuk that says that Hashem lifts people up. Actually, you think about it, I think the word at which you should bow is atah, because atah means you are speaking to something that someone who's present. Hashem is a name. By itself, a name could be used for someone who's absent. The word that indicates that you are in the presence of someone, and it's in nochach, there's like a facing, is the word atah, it's you. I say you, then I hear it better that way. We say Hashem all the time, and under any different kind of conditions, standing, sitting, walking. I mean, the name itself doesn't indicate. It's the atah that indicates. I think it's more appropriate to bow with the atah. Yeah.
In the Be'er Mikdash, when they heard the name, didn't they all like prostrate on the ground? Say Baruch Shem Kavod Matul Amed. Was there no atah in that?
No. It was Hashem Chata. Well, Chats we don't bow, but the other ones, no, it wasn't a blessing in that sense. And there, that's hearing the name being said by the high priest in the presence of the temple. It's not. It's him speaking to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. But and that's the address. The address there is with the name. There's no atah. So when you have the atah, it's much more direct. That's what I would say. I'm thought of the question, so I'm just speaking off the top of my head. Yeah.
So yesterday you mentioned that there's an idea to not start from where you were before. After a person sins, you don't want to go back to where you were before you sinned, but to start from a different place. Is there any way?
Yeah, I think I was a little tiny bit more specific than that. I didn't say it was different. I said, you don't want to be back where you were. You want to add something to that place. You don't want to be in the exact same place. So you go back to where you were, but when you get back to where you were, you make an addition to where you were. So if you're standing on the mountains without a fence, go back to the same mountain, stay in the same place, but add a fence. That would be the idea. Not to go to the seashore. I think that's the way the Rabbi Zatzal said it to us. You have a question?
You're in the middle of Amida. It's not really about what you were saying, but if you're behind, but they're like finishing up Amida and you're like way behind them, would it be too much of a trouble for you to try finishing just to catch up to them, or how would that work?
So are you in a kitchen place where you started with them?
You started with them,
right,
but you're like a little slower than them and can't really catch up.
Don't catch up. Say it at your own pace. When you start together with everybody else, that means that you're part of the minyan that's praying together. When you finish, makes absolutely no difference. I would not change your pace at all. Just do it at your own pace. When you finish, then you pick them up wherever they are. You don't have to worry about that. Yeah.
I'm talking about the Amida. I take a little time during the first bracha in between when you say Melech Hazer Mashiach Magain. I try and focus on those words for a long while. I've been told that might not be okay to do.
A long while is half hour?
Well, no, more like 5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes. I have no idea. I I don't know the halachas of davening well enough to say that there's. I can unhear that there's the problem. I couldn't say authoritatively whether there's any problem there. I will only tell you one thing, and this doesn't decide it, but it's something to keep in mind. There is a sefer called Derech Eretz, and in it has the following statement: if everybody's sitting, don't stand up. If everybody's standing, don't sit down. If everybody's laughing, don't cry. If everybody's crying, don't laugh. Now, those aren't universal rules. Sometimes you have a reason to stand up that other people don't have. Could happen. But you have to know that you should hesitate and think, should I do this or shouldn't I? Being different from everybody else around you is a spiritually challenging position. People will look at you and may draw conclusions or may react to you in certain ways. And you yourself can say, since I'm different from everybody else, in your own mind, you think, are we equal? Am I better? Am I worse? Am I weird? You can't help thinking those thoughts. And when you deal with those thoughts, the way you deal with those thoughts can be spiritually challenging. So again, I'm not saying not to do it, but I'm saying take this into account, realize that this is part of what's going on, perhaps think about it and make sure that you're dealing with that part of it in an appropriate way. More than that, I wouldn't say. Yeah, questions? This is Q&A. It's open Q&A. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a question with, so one thing that I've run across is that there's a brisa about the length of the lunar month, and said the tradition that was passed down was that the monthly cycle of the renewal of the moon takes no less than 29 and a half days, plus 2/3 of an hour, plus 73 of the 1,080 subsections of an hour. And that was in response to people coming in to say that the moon was, the month had started before it was supposed to. And supposedly that number lines up with the calculation that NASA did of the lunar month. But I was curious if you could speak on that, because it seemed a little, I don't know how they would have been able to, if that level of precision in their calculation for the lunar month is within reason for the level of technology they had for the time. But also, like, how does it line up with?
Okay, there are two things to be said here.
Yeah.
One is that there's no such thing as the length of the month, because every month is different. They aren't the same. So when somebody gives you a time for the length of the month, he either means that it's the mean length or the average length, but there's no such thing as the length of the month. Even NASA can't do that because it's different every month. That's number one. Number two, there's a very clever technique for getting accurate figures without technology. And this was even known in the ancient world. There are particular months where you can know pretty exactly when the month starts. That's when you have an eclipse. Because the month starts when the moon passes in front of the sun. And that's visible. Okay. You record the time. Okay, your timepiece is only approximate, let's say within a half hour. Somebody records another eclipse 1,000 years later. You have 12,000 months in that interval of time. So you divide the interval of time by 12,000, and you get a pretty accurate figure. So whether it's as accurate as NASA and it's as accurate as the one that we have, I don't know. Ours goes back, I think, goes back to prophecy, and I don't know that we kept track of lunar eclipses. But it is possible, in a natural way, to get a very accurate figure of the length of the month without technology. So that's not a bar to getting an accurate figure. There's a lot more to be said about this. My brushing with astronomy is very casual and superficial, but those two things I know. Yeah, what else? Yeah.
So you mentioned a little while ago, I might be misquoting you a little bit, but that the Ramchal talks about, he quotes that, or goes based off of the Rambam, even though the Rambam is not, doesn't use Kabbalah in what he does, and what he says, but the Ramban who does, he doesn't go based off of, and I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Okay, I didn't use the phrase or an equivalent phrase to based off of. I said quote. He quotes. The Ramchal was one of the greatest Kabbalists in the history of the Jewish religion. And nothing he says or does dilutes his position of Kabbalah in any way, shape, or form. But we have to realize, and here I think a lot of academia makes it very hard to realize this. When you talk about, let's say, the philosophical wing of the Jewish tradition, and you talk about the Kabbalistic wing of the Jewish tradition, and an unfamiliar person says, oh, these are philosophers, and these are mystics. Okay, that's like apples and pebbles, like that. They have nothing to do with one another, nothing in common, and they probably disagree about almost everything. And maybe it's two sects of Judaism. Well, that whole problematic is totally incorrect. It's totally incorrect. Many, perhaps almost all of the main themes of Jewish thought are in common between the philosophical and the Kabbalistic traditions. And to call the Kabbalistic tradition mystical is also prejudicial. The word mystic calls up someone who's deeply involved in emotion and in meditation and in non-standard experiences and so on. Whereas if you look at the Kabbalistic tradition, it is full of extremely precise, very elaborate, intricate structures with careful definitions and deductions of theorems and so forth and so on. It's an extremely precise, intricate, calculated set of information. Not at all, take a psychedelic and experience the moon. It's not like that at all. So, and in fact, the word Kabbalah in Hebrew is no connection whatsoever semantically to the word mystic. The word Kabbalah means tradition. Received tradition. The Kabbalah in Hebrew is to receive. And it means this information is received. No one thought it up and dreamt it up and had dreams and so forth. No, it's part of the tradition we received from Moses and from the prophets, especially the beginning chapters of the book of Ezekiel. So what we find is that the Ramchal, who's a great mystic, quotes Maimonides very often because there's material in Maimonides which is in common to the Kabbalistic tradition, and he quotes that. Not only he takes the terminology from the Rambam. He also, the Ramchal, now this people could disagree with me about. I only could say then if they disagree with me, they're wrong. But I'm a philosopher, so they'll tell me that I'm prejudiced. Okay, I don't think I'm prejudiced. The Ramchal thought like a philosopher. He thought like a philosopher. He raised questions that people with a philosophical temperament would raise and other people wouldn't typically raise. He made remarks that people like that, other people wouldn't raise. So he had a philosophical temperament, but he used it to understand Kabbalah. The Rambam not only had the temperament, but his analysis of the fundamentals of Judaism contains within it many themes that are in common with the Kabbalah. I'll give you two examples from the Ramchal where you see something of his philosophical temperament. We say twice in the morning that God makes the work of creation continuously. There's continuous creation going on. Creation is not something that happened thousands of years ago and then the Creator went on vacation, let it roll on its own. That's not a Jewish picture. It's a deist picture. It's not a Jewish picture. Ramchal asks, why did he do that? This is in Ma'amar al-Chachma, one of the editions of Ma'amar al-Chachma. He asked this question. I didn't see anybody else ask the question. And he points out in the same page that since HaKadosh Baruch Hu is all-powerful, there's nothing stopping him from making something and making it in such a way that it will carry on by itself. It wouldn't need constant input. It's not a matter of logic that something which he makes needs constant input. No. He could do it so that it stays on by its own. And the answer that he gives, I find astonishing. He gives a spiritual answer. The answer is that the purpose of human creation is that human beings should be in a special relationship of connection with God. And in order to be in a relationship of connection with Him, he has to be available. And it's through creating the world continuously, His will is supporting the existence of this table and the sky and my fingernails. So His presence is manifest in the fact that His will creates everything around me, and therefore He's available for a relationship. He's available for what we call dveikus. But the question that he asks is the question of a philosopher. And another example, many people have heard that in the Kabbalah you have 4 worlds, which in a certain sense is true. Maybe there are 5 or 6 or 1,000 or infinity, but there is a certain idea of 4 worlds. And they have name, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. Ramchal says, not really. Not really. The whole tradition. It's said thousands of times that there are 4 worlds. And he says, not really, because one of the 4 isn't a world. Oh, really? And he says this in the Derech Hashem in a chapter on prayer. Now let's see. He asks, what is a world? Who asks questions like that? What is a world? A philosopher asks a question like that. What is a world? And he says a world is a group of interacting entities. Well, in the Kabbalistic picture, where you have the 4 of them, the bottom 3, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, corresponding to the spirituality on that level, there are creatures, created beings on each level of different types. That's the bottom 3. When you go up to the top, there are no created beings on that level. So a field of interacting entities you don't have on that level. And then the Ramchal says, oh, but you'll ask me that in the spiritual side of that level itself, don't we have something called spheros, of which there are 10? And don't we have something that are called partsufim, of which there are 5? And don't we have other features that are interacting on that level? And he says, not really. Because on that level you have absolute unity. We talk about different features because the way that unity relates to us, we have to break it up into categories. But that doesn't mean that it's not a unity. It is a unity. So on that level, the level of Atzilus, really you don't have a group of interacting things. And therefore it's not really a world. To me it was astonishing when I read that. How can you say that in a tradition that talks about the 4 worlds? Okay? And again, it's a symptom of a philosopher that he would want a definition of world, and then he would want to see whether it fits the context of what's being used, and to understand it that way. So the Ramchal is a philosophical thinker, but for him, philosophy is a mode of interrogation or a mode of analysis of the subject matter that you're dealing with, and the subject matter you're dealing with is Kabbalah. I'll give you one more example. He wrote many works. We don't have all of them. At least 35 works. Maybe some of them were plays and some were dialogues. He wrote a sefer, which we do have and translated, called Das Tvunos, a very philosophical presentation of the fundamental ways in which God interacts with the world. He wrote a Kabbalistic work called Klolim Rishonim, First Principles, and it's clear that he meant them to be cross-reference, and in fact, Rabbi Friedlander, when he published them in one volume and showed how the cross-references work. So here you have 2 works, one written in straightforward philosophical vocabulary and one written in Kabbalistic vocabulary, and they're cross-referenced because they really have they're corresponding in what they address. The question is, what order do you think that he would write them in? I think they were finished like 4 months apart. Did he write the Kabbalistic one first and the philosophical one second, or vice versa? And when the person who told me this asked me, because I wasn't really into the things at that point, I said, well, of course, he wrote the Kabbalistic one first. He's a Kabbalist. And then he wrote a kind of philosophical exposition of it and explanation of it or application of it, but he must have started with the Kabbalistic one. It was not true. he started with the philosophical one. And he wrote the Kabbalistic one second. And the reason is this. The Kabbalah is a system. It's an intricate, elaborate system. A system of what? Well, it's a system of a model. This, I think, everyone agrees on. It's a system of a model. And then the question is, well, what is a model of? And here you have a big disagreement between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. And the Ashkenazim, Ramchal at the head, say that the Kabbalah is a model of a certain philosophical system. So the philosophical system is what's, so to speak, the real subject. And the Kabbalah is a way of modeling, encapsulating, organizing, structuring the philosophical system. But the philosophical system is the ultimate meaning. So he wrote the philosophical work first, and then he wrote the Kabbalistic structuring of it afterwards, not vice versa. So again, he looks at the world as a Kabbalist, but even as a Kabbalist, the Kabbalah is dealing with a subject. And the subject, as he says, I think this is the Derech Hashem or one of the others for him, the whole subject of Kabbalah is how God runs the world. There's nothing else. Nothing about creation, how creation takes place, doesn't say anything about that. It just says parallels between certain features of the way divinity expresses itself on the one side and features of the world that are corresponding to it and therefore are related to it and regulated by it. That's it. That's all you're getting. So you start with the world, then you have this structure of how it comes into existence and how it's run. That's all. At any rate, that's all I meant to say is that he quotes him. Now, given that superficially, if you thought that Kabbalah and philosophy were two different worlds, you would find it perplexing that here this great Kabbalist doesn't quote the greatest of the medieval Kabbalists, which is Nachmanides, and he quotes extensively the greatest of the philosophical medieval tradition, which is Maimonides. But of course, given what I've just told you, it's not surprising at all. Someone else, yeah. No, okay. Yeah?
One random thing that I just thought of in this
Yeah.
in the class. I was reading in some other class I'd taken where they talked about how the world would exist for 6,000 years and then it would stop existing for 1,000 years, and before with the Messianic era. I don't know if that's enough to go on or if you have any idea what I'm talking about.
I do know what you're talking about. It's a famous statement in the Talmud, actually, the Babylonian Talmud. It's the opinion of one author, and therefore the Rambam rejects it. But leaving that aside, many do accept it. And by the way, there's another opinion that it will stop for 2,000. Right there in the Talmud. One says for 1,000, one says for 2,000. Now, as Maimonides analyzes it, you have to be a little careful here. So the world is spinning on and developing and transforming for 6,000 years. And in 7,000, it stops. Stops? Everything stops? Maimonides says, what is time? And like Einstein said, time is what clocks do. Time is what clocks do. That's why when you're moving at relative speeds and a clock speeds up, we say the time speeds up. It's not that the clock's getting it wrong. The clock's spring is too strong and it's running fast. No, the clock is the time. Now imagine that everything stops. Well, then there's no time. If everything stops, there's no time.
But how can you stop without time? Have no time for an amount of time?
Correct. That's why there's no time. There isn't any amount of time. Time doesn't apply. It's not as if it took a very short, a nanosecond. A nanosecond is an amount of time. It's like having $0. That's not an amount of money. That's not an amount of money. $0 is not a certain amount of money. It's no money. Zero isn't like $6 or $25. It's not like owing $17. Zero means there's no money on the surface. There's no money to talk about. And therefore, it can't be total stop of everything. Maimonides uses that to criticize certain people who think that after 6,000 years, the whole creation dissolves and something else happens. You can't count the 7,000 years. And he says it's the opinion of one scholar, and nowhere is it codified as it's agreed upon, and therefore he rejects it. So does the Barbanel reject it. But the idea that those who accept it, especially in the Kabbalistic tradition, the idea is that we are in a certain state of being, and that state of being has its rules, has its character, and this is like the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos. We are in the entranceway to a great hall. We're in the lead up, the alleyway into the great hall, and this isn't the great hall. So you have to know that there's something else which is very different from it. As different as an alley is from a banquet hall. So this state of being and the next coming state of being are different, very, very radically different.
But again, it says it. Well,
Yeah.
It's one opinion. So saying that it stops for 1,000 years implies that it would restart. But then how would you measure?
Oh no! Why do you say that it would restart? No.
I thought it would
Well,
stop.
stop. It doesn't stop. I just proved that it can't stop. It functions in a very, very different way, which is its first step beyond what the character of the 6,000. And then there are steps beyond that as well, leading to an entirely different, very, very greatly different state of being. So when it says the 6,000 years, it means there's a certain type of organization which is consistent over the 6,000 years. In the 7,000 year, you have a different kind of organization going on, very different from the prior. And then there are further stages of transformation until you get to a position where the ultimate state is a very, very different state from what we're used to. Maybe I'll just give you a hint of this. In the sefer that I mentioned, the Astronomy of the Ramchal, he describes this with respect to the body and the soul. The body and the soul are created as antagonistic. He says in the Derech Hashem, why do we have a body and a soul? Because the fundamental feature of human existence is free will. And free will requires that you have competing motivations. And if this isn't obvious, I'll share with you an example that was given in the Journal of Philosophy maybe 25 years ago by a very interesting writer. I don't think he was even Jewish. He was talking about free will. And he said, imagine a situation like this. Someone is at a lawn party of a very wealthy family, and there's music and food and drink and everything else. And there's a pool, and the pool is unprotected. And he happens to stroll over to the pool, there's nobody else around the pool, and he sees an 18-month child fall into the pool. Okay, he has two choices. Take the child out or let the child drown. Now let's think. Let's think about his motivations. I'm not asking you to imagine a monster here. Think about normal people. What in his motivation is in favor of saving the child from the pool? All he has to do is lean down, grab his shirt, and pull it out. He won't even get his pants dirty. Well, number one, it's the right thing to do. Saving a human life. The parents will love you forever. Parents will love you forever. Everybody will be happy with you and proud of you. There's a lot going for saving the child. Okay, let's try the other side. What in you motivates you to let the child drown? I think realistically, the answer is nothing. Yeah, but what? It'll take me 10 seconds? I can't afford the 10 seconds? I make a phone call? I mean, what is in you that would which would motivate you to let the child drown? And the author of this paper, I think, said very realistically, nothing. And he said, if so, you're not making a free choice when you take him out. A free choice requires conflict. Both alternatives have to, in the modern jargon, resonate with you. There'll be something in you that leans you to both directions. Free will is making a decision between competing motivations. And that's why, he says, we are created with a good inclination and an evil inclination. That's the first move. This is really philosophical. That's the first move. Got to have good and evil, so they'll conflict, pull you in two directions, so you can have free will. And then the good inclination is expressed in the soul, and the evil inclination is expressed in the body. the soul and body as creatures, as created things, are created in order for you to have this conflict of motivation. That's why you're created that way. We are the only creature in the whole of the creation that has a double identity, or a duplex identity, I should say. It's better than double. All other creatures have different types of identities, but no other creature is the combination of two elements operating together. And here the operation is, in part, to a certain extent, in a certain particular way, it's oppositional, so that you can have a conflict of motivation. That's how we're created. But that's not what we're destined for. We are destined for a condition under which there's no longer any opposition. And indeed, there's a certain type of unity between the two. Now, here I have to avoid a possible ambiguity. When I say that A and B are unified, I don't mean that they're identical. I mean that they are integrated into a single thing where they cooperate with one another. So you have to distinguish between unification and identity. Unification doesn't mean that it's all the same. You know, a string quartet, if they're good, are unified, even though you have two violins, a viola, and a cello. They're not the same instruments, but they're not playing the same score. So here, the body and soul start out as oppositional, and they end up as unified. Now, the Ramchal says that from where we are, we could call ourselves on stage 5. We have 4 elevations to get up to stage 1. The first one we have described actually in our literature, and that is Moses on Mount Sinai. Moses on Mount Sinai doesn't eat or drink or sleep actually for 40 days. How come? And let me ask you a question, a crude question. When he came down after the first 40 days, was he a scarecrow? I mean, how much weight did he lose in those 40 days? He didn't lose any weight? Well, how's that? If he didn't eat and drink, how could he not lose weight? The answer is because he's in a different sphere, and in that sphere, ingesting physical material to maintain your weight isn't necessary. It isn't necessary. When you eat, the food goes into the body. Food doesn't go into the soul. It's an interesting question how the body eating can affect the soul, in particular keep you alive, where life is a relationship between the soul and the body. How does ingesting food into the stomach keep the soul present? Well, one thing's for sure, the soul is not consuming the food. When he went up to Mount Sinai, he was in a different sphere of existence where the spiritual could nourish the body instead of having the physical nourish the body. And God was teaching him Torah, and the receiving of Torah kept his body alive, kept his body weight, kept him hydrated. Right? So that's a sense in which the body is much less oppositional to the soul. Here, a soul activity gives nutrition to the body rather than an animal activity gives nutrition to the body. That's step 1 going up. Now, there are 3 more steps going up to get to the top situation. And in the top situation, the opposition of the body has been overcome entirely. And now the body plays a role of an adjunct to the soul. And the image that's given here is this. We have a picture that everything that exists is supported by God's will continuously. We mentioned that before. The model for this is a spark of fire enclosed in a shell which is opaque. The spark of fire is contributing energy to the shell from the inside. It's not as if it's not having an effect. It's just not visible on the outside. That's why we don't see God's will operating around us. And in fact, at the parting of the sea, where it says, they said, "This is my God and I will glorify him." And the commentators say, THIS, or Zeh in Hebrew, is only for something that's present. One explanation is the shells became transparent and they could see the sparks. At that moment, they could see that, therefore they could point to the sparks and say, "This is my God." Okay, so now when you think of a shell that's opaque, it hides the light entirely. It can become translucent. You see that there is light in between, but you can't see the light distinctly. Then the shell can become transparent. You could see the light, but there's a step beyond that. The step beyond that is these. This is glass or plastic. It doesn't just pass the light through. If it did, it wouldn't correct your vision. No, it focuses the light. That's where the shell becomes a participant in the spreading of the light. It focuses the light. The light has a bigger effect because the shell is there. So it's participating in the process of the light. That's the ultimate reconciliation. That requires stages of development where the soul, the body goes from its position of opposition to a neutral position, let's say, of transparency, to a position where it becomes actually a participant in the spreading of the light. That's a simple model of the way in which the whole of the universe has to undergo such transitions. And for the Ramchal, I haven't checked this very broadly, but he says it over and over again. Ramchal, the whole universe goes through such a transition. Nothing gets lost. The ultimate conservation law. Even the mosquitoes will be in the world to come. They just won't bite. Or whatever they will be, or whatever they will do. Nothing gets lost. So it all transforms into that harmonious medley of, beyond our words to really describe. So that's the later stages that beyond the 6,000 years, one by one. That's a rough approximation. Yeah.
Rabbi said there's one pull towards the good. Is that pull towards the good to do it also for the right reason, meaning to do it just for MS, and then there would be a spectrum from the bad and the good, let's say doing it 99% for good, which wouldn't be totally doing it for MS, let's say doing it because people would look at you. And also how does one expand their sense of self to include the soul and God?
Okay, so the first part of the question is a very nice question. Yes. I'll give you an example of this because I think this is a really important point. Ethics, to a large extent, has lost sight of the study of virtue. Ethics is consumed with right and wrong, good and evil, justice, obligation, promises, and so forth and so on. It's consumed with behavior, your effect on the world, rather than elevating yourself. Hey, here's an example to show you the inadequacy of that as a total picture. I'm not saying you shouldn't be engaged in it, but as a total picture. Consider my friend George. George has a bad habit. He has sticky fingers. He steals. That's what he does. I've talked to him about it. Nothing helps. He steals. I know he's going to Beijing on business. I say to him, George, listen, we've talked about this, but let me tell you something. In Beijing, there are hidden cameras everywhere, and there are plainclothes policemen everywhere. And in Beijing, you steal, they cut off your hand. So I'm suggesting to you, when you go to Beijing, control yourself and don't do it. Now, for some unreasonable thought he has, he trusts me, and he believes what I say, and he goes to Beijing, and he stops stealing. Gets caught there in business for 6 months, and he dies there. Well, how should we classify George now? Has he become a better person? Is he righteous? Is he just? No, he just doesn't want to lose his hand, that's all. His moral character hasn't changed at all. I just convinced him that it wasn't worth his while to steal. That's not a moral success. Yes, it's better not to steal than to steal. It's even better not to steal for non-moral reasons than it is to steal. When you steal, you hurt other people, and there are consequences. But still, there's a lot more to do in morality than that. And to talk about the good, it has to be done because it's good. That's what we would have wanted for George. Stop stealing because he realizes it's wrong. So yes, the idea of the soul being attached to the good is doing the good because it's good. Now, when you have people who are doing the good for some other reason, so then you have the difference between the status of their moral character versus the actions that they do. And those are two genuine things to talk about and two genuine things to evaluate. And here, as you sort of indicated, there are many, many variations. A person can do something spectacularly good for a spectacularly vicious reason. I'm going to distinguish myself in charity, so that people will trust me so I can rob the bank. My only goal is to rob the bank. If I had the accommodation of the safe, I wouldn't give a nickel to anybody. But that's my way of doing it. They'll trust me, and then I'll get in and I'll rob the bank. And there are people like that. They do for reputation. So that being the case, the conversion has to be a conversion of sharing the vision of the good and doing it because it's good. The vision of the body will, I think, be a lower vision of it, but that's what the vision will be, a vision of that, not of something else. Good observation. Yeah, what else is on people's minds? Yeah.
Is the Yetzer Harah and Yetzer Tov a separate entity from the person, or is it a part of the person?
Actually, okay, I'll take you at your word. If you think of the person as a conglomerate of parts, then it's a part of the person. A person has many parts. A person is a conglomerate, like a human body. A human body has hands, feet, head, toe, all the organs, and it's one body. It's one integrated body. At this point, we don't think of the human being as a single homogeneous dot. Human being has a lot of features, and when they're integrated in a certain way, that's what makes up a human being. So yes, now that's the Yetzer Tov, the Yetzer Harah, although the word Yetzer Harah has two different meanings. And I would say there's one which is a part of the person, and another one which isn't a part of the person. Nothing is simple in Torah. Nothing's really simple. And maybe I'll say a word about this because it'll give me a chance to elaborate on what I said before. I said several times that even in creation, the body is opposed to the soul in a certain sense. There are two types of opposition, at least. Maybe there are more. There are two types of opposition. One is, you want X, I want not X. You want X, I want you not to have X. You're going up, I'll pull you down. There's a verse in Proverbs, stolen waters are sweet because they're stolen. That's why they're sweet. Because I didn't earn them, I didn't find them on my own, I stole it. That's what makes it good. That is the dedicated, premeditated, oppositional Yetzer Harah. I want evil because it's evil. And there is such a thing. There is such a power. That's not the body. There's another kind of opposition which is due to moral and spiritual blindness, which then leads to actions which are bad actions. It's the proverbial bull in a china shop. As the bull wanders through the china shop, smashing things with its body and with its tail, it's not interested in smashing the china. If there were a path with no china in the way, we'd walk on the path also. But when it goes through the china gets smashed. The body is an element that wants what it wants when it wants it, period. No thought of whether it's good or evil at all. I'm hungry. I want a sandwich. For my stomach, it doesn't matter whether it's Yom Kippur and I'm supposed to be fasting, or it's a holiday when I'm supposed to be eating, or it's January 16th where it doesn't matter whether I'm eating or fasting. My stomach doesn't care. My stomach also doesn't care whether it's my sandwich or your sandwich. The stomach has no interest. It just wants the food. That's the body. The body is morally and spiritually blind, and therefore it will come into opposition with the soul because it doesn't take soul factors into consideration in its desires. The difference between the two of them is that you can, to use the Freudian term, sublimate the body, but you can't sublimate the first one. Because sublimate means to use its power, to use its energy in a context in which it'll be positive rather than negative. The first one says, positive? Not me. I'm not going there. I want to destroy. I don't want to build. You can't subvert him, and that's why our literature says that one at the end of time has to disappear. But the body doesn't disappear because it can be elevated. It can even be trained. It can be by focusing it and controlling it and setting up limits for it. So for a while it resists, and while it's resisting, you have to use power to force it within the limits that you want it to be in. But it can happen that after years of applying force to it and applying pressure to it, it becomes trained. And after a while, it stops resisting. The resistance dies away bit by bit, and it stops resisting. And then it comes to a point where, it's like breaking a wild horse. That's what they call it, breaking it. And the way they do it is for the cowboy to ride it and somehow survive when it's bucking with all of its strength. And afterwards, they become they're calm, and they interact with the rider in obviously harmonious ways, and they do, just give them a tiny tap, and they go to the other side. They're like they're integrating with the rider. So that's a little bit of an emblem of what happens to the body. So this body is part of the person. I heard a very beautiful expression many years ago, and I said it over and over and over again until I really realized it was wrong. The expression was, don't say you have a soul. That's a mistake. You are a soul. You have a body, but you are a soul. So I said, isn't that clever? I love clever things. But it isn't quite right, because you are soul and body together. It's not that you're a soul and you have a body. You are soul and body together. You are a compound of soul and body. That's why, according to the vast majority, Rambam disagrees, but the vast majority, after resurrection, go into the world to come with the body. And that's why the Ramchal described the four stages of elevation, where the soul and body become reconciled, that they can become one unified entity out of two pieces, which are unified in their goals and their function, but it's still two, and the body is there, because the human being is the soul and the body together. It's not just the soul riding around in a body. So that's how the thing works. Yeah.
Where does the first one come from?
Which one?
The first Yetzer Harah. The second one we said comes directly from the body.
Oh, it's Rav Dester who writes about this. I'm taking this from Rav Dester because he says it's an angel. It's external. Yeah, it's not part of you.
I was saying maybe it could be like a extra shutting down of the free will. Like you could do something right, and you could do something blocking the right and doing it wrong.
Yeah, but well, I don't know. See how that's related to what we're saying. If it's dedicatedly evil, if it contains the concepts of good and evil, and it only goes after things which are identified as evil, then there's no way of rehabilitating it. There's no way of elevating it. There's no way of co-opting it into Kodesh Baruch Hu's service. When it says you should love Hashem with both your, Mishnei Yetzarecha, with your two urges, it's not talking about that one, because that one won't love Hashem. It just won't do it. It's impervious, and therefore would have to be destroyed. It plays a temporary role in free will, but it's a temporary role. Whereas the body plays a role in free will, and because of its ability to be transformed, becomes permanent. It's absolutely permanent, eternal. Yeah.
So, from what I understand, we're not. Okay, I shouldn't say that, but we're not really supposed to learn Kabbalah until a certain point. But the Ramchal is universally used, and I want to know if we are able to learn it because he gives Musar that pertains to us in the now, to most human beings, or if there's another reason.
Okay, let's start with the first one. This is important to know. You will hear you're not allowed to learn Kabbalah until you're 40 years old. Well, the Arizal, the greatest Jewish Kabbalist of the last 500 years, died before the age of 40. Ramchal died before the age of 40. Gee, were they criminals? I don't think so. That's not the right idea. The whole of the Sephardi world learns Kabbalah from childhood. I was over here in the Bukharim Shuk, this is like 40 years ago, and it was twilight. I had davened mincha there, I was waiting for Mariv, and a kid, maybe 10 years old or 12 years old, comes up to me out of the shadows and says, "Why do we daven Mariv?" I'm a total stranger. So I said, "Why do we daven Mariv?" Well, let's see, the Gemara says that Shachos and Mincha are mitzvahs, and this is a minhag, or maybe it's something more than minhag. No! Abba and Ima are together, and the parts is over here, and the sphere's over there, and there's an interaction, and a zivug, and he rattles off this Kabbalistic thing, and then walks off and disappears into the shadows. What was that? At that point, I had never looked at any Kabbalah. I had no clue what he was talking about. They learn these things as kids. The Hasidic tradition starts Kabbalistic ideas much earlier than 40. This idea of 40, if I remember correctly, is the Shach, who's one of the great Ashkenazi authorities, and he said it for a certain population of people, but other communities disagree. It's something about which there is disagreement. Your community and your particular person who guides you in your Torah development, and your particular background and understanding and mental set and a status of information is all taken into account, deciding whether you should study Kabbalah or not. Now, there's a difference between Kabbalah, capital K, versus works that are influenced by the Kabbalah. The Mesilas Yesharim, Path of the Just, when I asked my Rebbe Zatzal, should I study Musar, not Kabbalah, Musar, which means works of ethical self-improvement, he said, if you're going to, yes, he said, and if you're going to, study the Mesilas Yesharim because it's based on Kabbalah. There isn't a single Kabbalistic word in the whole book. But it has 26 chapters. Does 26 ring a bell to anybody? That's the numerical value of God's name. And it has 10 levels. Does 10 ring a bell? There are lots of 10s. That's right. And the whole Kabbalah is based on 10. And the Ramchal was sort of putting a signature into it, Hello, 26, 10, pay attention. But you can read the book without having heard of Kabbalah. And you can get a great deal of Musar out of it. But it's based on Kabbalah. The Musar expression is something which is taken from Kabbalah. There's absolutely no limit on that. Absolutely no limit on that. Hasidim went a step further, and they used Kabbalistic ideas to explain and enrich ideas that are in the what's called the exoteric, as opposed to the esoteric. Esoteric is what's hidden. Exoteric is what is open and widely and commonly known. To explain verses in the Torah, to explain various mitzvahs that we do, to explain passages in the Siddur. They use the Kabbalah that way, and that's done everywhere. That's done everywhere. Just usually they don't tell you. They give you the gist, and they don't tell you where it's coming from. They don't use the Kabbalistic vocabulary. So it's not as if you mustn't have any contact with Kabbalistic ideas. It's certain types of texts and certain types of presentations that would be identified this way. The works of the Arizal, for example, would be straight Kabbalah, and others similarly that are straight Kabbalah. And there, you should have the right preparations for you, in your context, in your community, with your particular spiritual development. There's no one-size-fits-all prescription as to when and how and where that you should do it. More common thought is that you should be married. That's something else.
What about the Derech Hashem, though? That's pretty...
There isn't a single word of Kabbalah in Derech Hashem, not one. The ideas are there, but they're expressed in an entirely different form. And they are... it's just like the Das Tvunos, which is philosophical, and the Klolim Rishonim, which is Kabbalistic, and they're cross-referenced. But you can read the whole of the Das Tvunos and not know there's any such thing as Kabbalah. So the fact that a Kabbalist wrote it and he incorporated Kabbalistic themes doesn't mean that you're studying Kabbalah. For the purposes of not studying Kabbalah, it's not a problem. Yes?
I was told there's a Gemara that says מחשבה is not considered kamaisa by Avera. I'm assuming מחשבה is meaning like Ratzon. I'm trying to understand that because I thought that we only have control over Ratzon. Like we only have control.
Okay, I'll speak of. First of all, the Gemara there has like 5 different clauses, and sometimes yes, and sometimes no, and Jews yes, and Jews no. First time and second time, sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. But that's a separate issue. You have to pay attention to the words "considered like." Considered like means, well, there's some context in which it doesn't play the same role. Maybe for reward and punishment, it doesn't play the same role. Or for protection of this world, it doesn't play the same role. We're not doing abstract philosophy now. We're talking about what the consequences will be when you have a decision with an action that follows it, the decision without an action that follows it. And that doesn't mean that I have to be in control of the action. You're being told, when an event of this shape happens, these are the consequences. When an event of this shape happens, these are the consequences. These are the consequences of the event. You know, if someone pulls a trigger and the other person dies, that's because there was no wind blowing to blow the bullet aside. The gunpowder was dry. He was pointing it in the right direction, and the guy stood there and didn't faint. Did he really, on his own, by himself, cause him to die? No. There's lots of cooperation from the circumstances. Otherwise, he wouldn't have died. So, but still, he's treated as a murderer, even though for circumstances had to cooperate with the event for it to have that effect. So the fact that, let's say, I make a decision and God causes my body to carry out the decision doesn't mean I'm not responsible for it. It doesn't mean that the shape of the event doesn't. There's a deep idea here. Let's see if I can give you the headline without, because it takes like a half hour to motivate it. How can I be responsible for what the body does? This is sort of your question. I'm just putting it in slightly different words. If what happens in an action is I decide and God makes the body work, how can I be responsible for what the body does? I can be responsible for my decision. That's what I did. But I can be responsible for what the body does. You can be. You can be. And here's how it works. I know from experience that the body does almost always, 99.999% of the time, does what I decided it should do. That's what happens. I'm taking little things like raising your arm and blinking your eyes, and all the things you do during the day. The body very, very faithfully repeats what you decide to happen. So here's what I know. If I decide X, the body will do X. And if I decide Y, the body will do Y. None of what I have just said implies that I control the body, or I force the body, or I cause the body. No, I just know there's a correlation between what I decide and what the body does. So, if I decide X and the body carries out X, and I could have decided Y, I'm responsible for the fact that the body does X because, had I decided otherwise, I know from experience that the body would have done otherwise. Even if I'm not forcing the body. It's enough to be able to predict and have an alternative to make you responsible for what happens. That's, I think, the way responsibility works. So I don't think it's a problem, the fact that so now, when the Kosh Baruch Hu has the body do that, it's because he wants the whole event to have certain consequences. It's just like, I'll give you one more example and I have to quit. Let's say two people commit murder. In one case there are witnesses, in one case there aren't. Why were there witnesses in the first case? Well, God's running the world and he can arrange that. They had an appointment, the car broke down, they're looking for a gas station, and they just happened to be there when it took place, right? And the other case not. Well, one guy's going to be punished, and the other guy's going to be punished. Well, that's what God wanted to happen. He wanted this one to be punished. He didn't want that one to be punished. So he arranged it that way. Similarly, I have a will to do something. Sometimes the body carries it out. Sometimes I get caught. I'm standing on this side of the street. There's traffic. I see a poor person over there. I think when the light turns green, I'm going to go over and give him charity. Buses go by. Trucks go by. The light turns green. I cross. He's lost. He's gone. He left. I made the decision, but the circumstances didn't allow me to carry it out. Okay, that means that in this complex, I won't get all the consequences that I would have gotten had it been carried out, even if I'm not the one who's doing it. Because Baruch Hu wanted that to be the outcome of this particular event. So he gave it that complexion. That's all that's necessary. Okay, listen, very good session.